All right, and we got the closed captioning going.
We do.
All right, so I want to welcome everyone here. We'll get started with our Maine town meeting. This is an experiment this year. We're trying to do it hybrid, and we'll see how well that works. Last time we were able to do it in person was in 2019. We had 90 people for that. So it's going to obviously be a rebuilding work in progress. We had about 80 people register, and we had 12 people who said they were going to come in person. We're still waiting on a couple of people. So I thank those of you who are guinea pigs for this experiment in doing a hybrid Maine town meeting. We'll just have to see how it goes and plan accordingly for future events. So I want to just go over some Zoom protocols. After 2 years, probably people are familiar with. Please, those out in the virtual land, if you could keep your sound muted till it comes time to ask questions. And if you want to ask questions, there's the chat function probably down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be monitoring those and can ask the questions for you. Or if you want to raise your hand and ask it live, we can make that happen as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to let the virtual audience ask questions first, since the live audience will have more access to the speaker even after we close down. And I want to point out that we have a couple of anniversaries that I want to note. We picked today, June 1st, because it's the 72nd anniversary of Margaret Chase Smith's very famous Declaration of Conscience speech. And in the chat box, I put a link to that speech if anyone needs a reminder of what she spoke about on June 1st, 1950, at the height of the McCarthy era. The other thing I've done is put a link to some interviews I did with colleagues of Jonathan at the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center to give you a flavor of all the wide range of projects that are going on at the center. And they are now archived on our YouTube channel. So there's a link there that'll take you right to those interviews. And at this point, I want to mention a couple of people. One is the benefactor of the Maine town meeting, which is a man named Colonel Paul LaFond, who is a very faithful attendee at our Maine town meetings. He was in the Marine Corps, and when he passed away, his family thought it'd be a nice tribute to donate some money to help fund our annual Maine town meeting. So we thank the LaFond family for that. And I also want to point out that we have our essay contest winner here, Simon Hall. Simon, can you give a wave to the virtual audience? Thank you very much. And Simon, where do you go to school?
So I'm a senior at Edward Little High School in Auburn, and next year as well.
Where will you be headed to? Yeah.
Next year, I'm going to Middlebury College in Vermont.
And do you have an idea of what you'd like to study?
I think I want to study biology.
Very good. And we'll be making the formal presentation of his award after the Maine town meeting is over, but I want the audience at least to be able to meet Simon. So thank you for being here, Simon, and his family as well. And then that brings me to our speaker for today, Jonathan Rubin, who is the director of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center. He received his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of California, Davis. He has been at the University of Maine since 1999. He also has an appointment with the School of Economics. He's been the director of the center since 2016. He's had Fulbright scholarships in Botswana, in Africa, and also more recently in Canada. He's fairly recently back from a stint there. He is on the Maine Climate Council. His area of expertise is transportation issues, which he will talk to us about today, in addition to how the Policy Center became connected to Margaret Chase Smith, and more generally, what it is that policy centers do, and specifically what the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center does. So I welcome Jonathan as our speaker.
Thank you, David. And I first of all, thank you, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. I was just talking to the people in the room, and I don't normally speak to a general audience like this. I'm a technocrat. I speak to professional conferences, so it's really it's an honor to be here. The work at the library and And I appreciate this town hall. I think civic engagement like this is absolutely really, really important. I mean that bottom of my heart. So a little bit of the background. David said, can you talk a little bit about why you named the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center? And this really goes back to 1990, when the center, the then founding director of the Public Policy Center, it was called the Center for Public Policy Studies, University of Maine, brand new initiative saying, well, we heard about this policy thing, maybe the university should have a policy center. They created one, no funding, of course. And so the founding director, Steve Ballard, said to Margaret Chase Smith, I honor you. We believe in your mission. Will you grant us the use of your name? And apparently it was not something she was going to immediately accept. And it was only after hours of discussions and coming to a meeting of minds that she gave her blessing. And she said it at a wonderful time. And she said, I'd be honored to have my name associated with the center. And she said, I will never, this I quote from a book by Ann Atchison, who wrote a history about this. It's available at the University of Maine. But Ann Atchison is the author of the chapter. And she said, I'd be honored to have the name associated with the center, but I'll never tell you what to study, but make a contribution that is something important, to work on important issues. And I've tried to keep that to heart. Mert Henry, who many of you might know, was also, I guess, somewhat skeptical about this and dubious, because very protective of the library as the primary focus of the, but he also said she came around and she said her stipulation was it would be strictly nonpartisan. And that's really something we've taken to heart, I've taken to heart, and I really try very hard. Using her name is wonderful. It's helped the center. We are known. Unfortunately, I think we're a little bit known sometimes in the state for being a Republican policy center, and the Muskie School is a Democratic policy center. And I assure you that's not true. There are Democrats and Republicans in my center, I think. I don't really care. And I know in the Muskie School, they do work that is not only Democratic, but also generals. So it's really, it's not a DNR thing. It really is a nonpartisan effort. And but it's very hard. So the only funding that came with her name was in part for a speaker series called the Margaret Chase. We have a Margaret Chase Smith lecture series, and we have a public affairs scholarship for undergraduates, and that's the only real foundation money we got from the naming. Of course, we get to use her name, and we're proud and honored by that. Over the years, we've gotten money from the Margaret Chase Smith Foundation, which supports the library. They give us a very nice donation today for, this is our Maine policy review. And I brought extra copies on the table there for anybody who didn't get it. This publication is peer reviewed. It is downloaded last I checked, 67,000 times in the last calendar year. Full article downloads from around the world. And it's truly become, I think for Maine and New England, it's become the journal of record for policy stuff. We do very careful about this, and fundraising for this is always difficult because, believe it or not, keeping a journal going in this day and age is hard. We also run a women's leadership program, which the foundation does support us with. We're 20, last week, most of the staff are supported by grants. We have about 22 full-time equivalents, if that means something to some of folks that work here. That's about 30 faculty, staff, and students that supports on an annual basis. People work on economic impact assessment, aquaculture, forestry sector, craft beers, economic development, workforce development, skills need, substance abuse, harm reduction, naloxone distribution. These are some, David Richards recorded some of these from some of the staff. So I'm not going to talk about all the great work my colleagues do. I work in transportation and greenhouse gas emissions, which is really all I care about these days. I had my last decade, and that's what I'm trying to make my mark on. As David mentioned, I've had great luck being working in Botswana was very, very interesting. For a year, I worked on biofuels, sub-Saharan Africa. There's not a lot of South Africa has and both want to have coal, but they don't have any fuels to run vehicles. So it's really it's a security issue. I had a chance to work in the University of Cambridge for a year on climate mitigation research. So I've been put because of the, and nationally, I sit on two important national boards. I hate talking about myself, but I'm going to give you a little background. So there's a Transportation Research Board as part of the National Academy of Sciences. They also have, you probably know, National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. This is transportation is another branch of it. So I sit on their Energy Committee, and I sit on their and I've sat previously on their Alternative Fuels Committee, and this was for a dozen years, setting research agendas and on national energy needs and use of light duty vehicles. So for those reasons, I was put on the Scientific and Technical Committee for the Maine's Climate Council. Maine's Climate Council was set up in 2019 by Law 1679, and in it, they said, well, we need a technical and scientific committee to give recommendations to the Climate Council on how to reduce Maine's greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. I've also been put in the equity subcommittee. So this committee has been looking at what is the equity, meaning low income minorities, what are the impacts of all the regulations that we're proposing or not proposing, or what are the impacts of climate on those most vulnerable people in the state of Maine. So we've been looking for that for the last year and a half. And also fun, I'll talk about it if you guys want to talk about it, is I'm also on the Maine Commission for Autonomous Vehicles to set up the rules for testing autonomous vehicles on Maine's roads. And that is, again, very, very interesting issues that you might come up with when you would never think about it. And so so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but that's just some of the background. And I'm just checking just be careful about time here. So we're strictly nonpartisan. Something you may not think about is I get asked a lot to testify in front of the Maine legislature or other places. And one of the things you work in a high profile position at the university, we have to be very careful not to be used by interest groups. So I'll get a legislature said, Jonathan, why don't you come and testify on this bill? And it's like, okay, why am I testifying on that bill? Like, you want to use Margaret Chase Smith's name, I get it, you don't care about me, but you want to use the good name of Margaret Chase Smith. So why is it that you want me to testify? Is it about my research, or so you just have to really be conscious about being used in a political way, because I don't think that that's what the senator would have wanted. I really try to honor that and not abuse it. And not every faculty member I know feels that way. I mean, we can talk about that later, but some folks really feel like, well, I'm an advocate. I went into this field because I believe in children's mental health. So I'm going to unabashedly argue for children's mental health. And that's fine, but that's in the Public Policy Center. I really try not to, I just say this is what the research says. I try really hard not to get drawn into political debates, because it is, anyway, it's one of the areas. So let me start off with a little bit of research. David said I should talk a little bit about my research. So I'll talk a little bit of a project that I'm just finishing up right now at the behest of Maine, the Maine Department of Transportation. Now, it's road salt, winter road salt. This is spring or almost summer. And you say, Jonathan, why should I care about winter road salt? Well, you should care. First of all, I'm going to give you a couple facts, which this report is available at the Margaret Chase Smith websites. If you Google road salt, my name at the Margaret Chase Smith Center, you'll find it. Currently, last year, there was 493,000 tons, 493,000 tons of salt put on Maine roads. And you say, that sounds like a lot. What's it mean? 780 pounds per person in the state of Maine, 11 tons per lane mile, 11 tons per lane mile. And that costs somewhere in the, and 80% of this is used at the town level, or 70%. The rest is used at the Maine Turnpike Authority and the Maine Department of Transportation. And why? Mobility and safety. It costs at all three levels of government, and this took a year and a half of research. We surveyed all the towns in the state of Maine. It costs roughly $155 million in expenditures in Maine to keep our roads clear. And it, as I say, 780 pounds per person. It causes significant ecological harm. What am I talking about? You say ecological harm. What's that mean? I'm talking about contaminated wells. Maine Department of Transportation is legally responsible for remediating wells contaminated with road salt, if it can be shown that Maine Department of Transportation is responsible. They spent $6 million in the last 5 years remediating wells contaminated by salt that they've put on for our safety. So the reason I say that this is really an important issue, after school budgets at the town level, this is probably the biggest single expenditure at the town level, 450 towns. This is, and so the fact that you don't know about this is part of the problem. And part of the solution is to change the way we use our roads in the wintertime. And that means we probably need to move away from a bare roads policy to a secondary and tertiary leave the road snow covered policy, meaning the roads in front of your house probably don't need to be salted. Now that's going to change people's behavior. It'll change the way traffic flows, but it's really not environmentally or fiscally sustainable to be spending that much money, $150 million a year. That much salt is really not sustainable, and it needs to change. And that means changing behavior, and that means changing conversations at the town level about really what to expect. We fight about school budgets, we fight about police forces. We ought to be having those same honest discussions about, do we really want to plow this often and use this much salt, because we know that that salt doesn't go away. It runs into our streams, runs into the groundwater, it doesn't go away, right? It's a problem, and so it can't continue. So anyway, that's a problem. That's work we did. We also, a few other things. So to do this type of work, how do you do work like that? Well, okay, I'm talking about 5 people. I hired the best statistician, I think, on campus for hydrology. His name is Shalene James, professor of civil engineering. We looked at every well contaminated for the last few years, and we tried to geospatially look at the bedrock and salt deposition and well test levels and see if we could get a spatial pattern. We think it's there, but we couldn't prove it because of underlying geological factors like fissures in bedrock seem to be dominant as explanatory. But we're still working on the statistics on that. And then we looked at every single road accident for the last 7 years, every fatality, every fender bender recorded by the police on every road. And we correlated that with weather from 16 stations to try to look at rain and snow. And again, we had probably the best statistician on campus, Ali Shirazi, again from Civil, to do that statistical analysis for us. And so what can I tell you about that? First of all, 2/3 of crashes occur during the winter, okay? About many fewer fatalities. Why? 2 reasons for fewer fatalities. One is people drive more slowly, a little bit, not always. And secondly is they run into snowbanks and they don't hit trees. So it's a combination of slowing down and some snowbanks that we think is what's saving people's lives. But the irony here, of course, is that as you salt the roads, you get down to bare pavement, people speed up. So there's this tension of the human reaction to the states and towns' policies of control, which are in some ways making things harder. If everyone just slowed down and didn't expect to be able to go the next day after a foot is dumped on us, you expect, well, maybe it's going to take me a couple of days to get out. Changing that mindset is what's necessary here. I would argue, I think it's important because we really cannot put this much salt on our roads year after year. So it's a real problem. So that's a typical type of work that we do for the state, highly detailed. You wouldn't want to, you could go to a consultant for it, but I think we as a policy center give unbiased, and we're very, I think we do a very good job in that type of work. But transportation greenhouse gas emissions, this is my heart. So I want to talk a little bit about this. So in 2019, Governor Mills signed in LD 1679, which created the Maine Climate Council. And it's a citizen, but scientists, it's citizen-led, but there's scientists, legislators on it. And it is the goal by legislation is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Maine, 45% by 2030, 80% by 2050, and be carbon neutral by 2045. What's carbon neutral mean? You jargon people, the people in the library said, you got to stop me not using jargon. What does carbon neutral mean? Carbon neutral, and it's used all the time in the climate change world, means that the emissions that are remaining are offset by, say, biologic growth from our Maine's forests. So to be carbon neutral means that we recognize that some sectors like heavy duty trucks are really hard to decarbonize and probably never will or won't by 2045. But if you can offset those by additional growth in biomass, you can get to a carbon neutral by 2045. That's what carbon neutrality means. So those are incredibly ambitious goals. And it was signed into law by Janet Mills, and I'm happy to support this. And so I want the question saying, okay, Jonathan, you just told us how hard you work on trying to be nonpartisan. Why are you supporting the governor's climate council work? And the answer is, I think is, well, not the answer. I'll tell you the answer is, the United States, I think, is unique amongst, not completely unique, but sort of unique amongst developed nations, developed advanced economies, Western democracies in particular, that climate change reductions has become partisan. It's not true of our closest allies, Canada. It's not true of our close ally, Great Britain, where the conservative parties support the goals. They differ with the timing and the implementation, but there's not this partisan divide that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in those societies. So I support and work with the Climate Council, not because Governor Mills signed it. I support it because it's the right thing to do from all accounts of the modeling. And I will say in Maine, observation, we know lakes freeze out times are changing. I mean, there's physical evidence now. It's not even a question. So if Governor LePage were to win re-election, I would hope that he would continue the work of the Climate Council. I'd be happy to work with Governor LePage in the next. So it's really not partisan. And I just want to emphasize that it sounds partisan, but it's only partisan because America a little bit has somehow got this divide where it does not exist in most of Europe and certainly not Canada. So what are some of the things we do for this? Okay, so I'm a specialist in there. Let me tell you some things I hope you find interesting. So as part of this work, Maine Department of Transportation came to me and they said, okay, Professor Rubin, they said, how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions on Maine roads? What's cost effective? So I said, well, what are the vehicles on the state of Maine roads? Who's driving what? First of all, you got to realize that if you're producing greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Maine, fully one half of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector. And that's because we don't have, it's not that our cars are any dirtier or our trucks are any dirtier. It's that we don't have petroleum refining. We don't have much mining, if any. We don't, our economy is not we have timbering, we have some construction, but it doesn't have the heavy industry that some of those. So half of our emissions are from the transportation sector. You got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, transportation sector. There's no choice. So the question, so you say to Maine, okay, what's on our roads? You might say, what is on our roads? You would think, well, so it turns out that Maine didn't have a good idea of what's on our roads. Why would they? Well, what Maine does have is it has vehicle registers. Every time you register your car, there's a little registration, and in the vehicle registration, there's something called a VIN, vehicle identification number. You probably filled that number in when you do your annual reports. A vehicle identification number, or VIN, has your vehicle make and model and engine and trim level in those little codes. And so working with Maine Department of Environmental Protection, they did most of it, but we helped them with some VIN decoding to understand, I can't look up David's records, but which, because there's some privacy issues here, right? We only get, so we have every vehicle registered in the state of Maine by a zip code. I want it by household, but I'm still arguing for why I need to know which car David drives. But give me another year and I'll be able to tell you, I'm hoping. So we worked with them and then we created, that's 1.2 million records, by the way. And there's about 50 fields per record. How far you drive, the trim level, all this information. So it's a huge database. And then you say, well, what's the fuel economy of a Ford Bronco? Well, then you got to go to another federal database and you have to merge them. So you're talking fairly complex programming involved here. You know, I hired somebody who's a specialist in doing this type of programming. So anyway, we created some reports for the state that said in these zip codes, we now know the fuel economy of every vehicle in the state of Maine. Light duty, the trucks, heavy duty trucks, medium duty trucks, the off-roads are more difficult. We have not done those. And we know where they live. So I can tell you, okay, this zip code is dominated by Ford Focuses. This one has, I can tell you where the electric vehicles are. And so this work is, in order to design effective policies, you need to know who drives those vehicles. And this is why I'm saying I need to know not just the zip code of those vehicles, but I need to know who it is, because I want to ask them, well, where do you work? How much money do you make? How many children do you have? Do you have medical needs? You know, you need to know something about the households and the vehicles, so then you can design policies that are not hurting people, but helping them. Because you don't, you know, you want, if you're going to have a vehicle tax or a registration tax or some type of incentive program, you need to really target. You do this, and that means you need to know something about the people. And so I'm still having these conversations at the state level about access to that admittedly private information of individuals. But I can tell you by zip code, you know, all the stuff. The next I'd say is, we also did, as part of that, a review of Maine's public transit system, all the public transits and who rides them and how do they get their funding. You may not know this, but in terms of the fare box revenues, if you were to take, say, I live in Bangor, if I was to take the Bangor area connector or the community connector now, I believe it's, I didn't look up this number, but off the top of my head, it's about 10 cents on the dollar is from the fare box. And this across the state of Maine and all public transit. And that's typical for public systems in the United States, like Maine, Vermont and New Hampshire, very similar. About 10 cents is from the fare box. The rest is through other programs, state, federal dollars, specialty programs. And so public transit, it serves an important need, but the economics of improving public transit are very challenging, I'll say that. So that's some sense of the work I've been doing, and we've been doing the center, because there's a lot of people helping with this work. But I've been putting the equity committee, which again, I think is pretty interesting. It's about 25 of us or so. And what we have done for the last 18 months is go through every recommendation of the various committees for the Climate Council. And we've now looked at them from an equity lens. How does this impact low-income people? How does it impact the tribes? How does this impact any community that's especially vulnerable, disabled, racial minorities? And so we've gone through each of these. So some of the high-level goals, I'll just tell you what they are, so you have a sense of what this is involved here. So some of the high-level goals are: embrace the future of transportation in Maine. Okay, electrification. Modernize Maine's buildings. Grow Maine's clean energy economy and good jobs. Okay. Build healthy and resilient communities. Protect Maine's environment and working lands. Invest in climate-ready infrastructure, means culverts that won't wash out with increased rain flows and floods. Reduce carbon emissions in industrial sectors. So how do we help the businesses reduce carbon? So those are all the high-level goals. You have to go through each and every item there and say, what does that mean in terms of implementation? I mean, a lot of people, a lot of work, but it's super interesting. So I work in transportation, so let me bring this home to you. So in transportation, what does that mean? That means, so one of the things we've recommended is increasing access to clean or low carbon, low emission transportation for especially low income communities. What does that mean? So out of your tailpipe, right, you have carbon dioxide, CO2, and you have what are called criteria emissions. These are human health emissions. Criteria is defined, it's a term from the Clean Air Act, US Federal Clean Air Act. And it defines certain things like oxides of nitrogen and fine particulates that actually hurt human health, hurt the lungs. So out of your tailpipe comes both greenhouse gas emissions and human health impacting emissions. So when we use the term clean transportation, it's shorthand for both low carbon and those that have human health impacts. They need not necessarily be always coincidence. You could have something that has really clean emissions from a human health perspective, but uses lots of energy and vice versa. So it's a little bit of a shorthand there. So let me bring that down to you. I'm a big biker. I hope some of you like to bicycle ride. So a lot of the bike advocates say, well, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to get more people biking. How do we get people biking? Electric bikes. Everybody, we should do e-bikes, right? And I would love to have an e-bike. I've driven e-bikes. I hope you guys have. Does anybody have an e-bike? Go borrow some. They're fun. They're really a lot of fun because it makes you feel like, oh, I feel good today, because you don't, sort of tricks your mind thinking that you're actually biking. Because you are biking. The really good ones, and I've ridden ones, are pressure sensitive, so that it only helps you a little bit. You can't fully cheat unless you turn up the dial, then you can fully cheat. But anyway, but if you look at it from an equity lens, you say, well, who buys an e-bike? It turns out that low-income people generally don't buy $2,000 electric bikes. It's wealthier people, it's urban people, it's younger people, it's fit people. That's who generally, not exclusively, but if you were to use public monies and subsidize e-bikes, you'd in fact be hurting equity, because you'd be giving money to people who least need it, right? So when you look through all these climate recommendations and you say, okay, yeah, e-bikes make sense, but does it merit public monies? And I'd argue no, it doesn't. And so that's what I'm saying, by going through an equity lens on each of these things, you really have to get micro and go climate. One of the things that we did strongly recommend is clean school transportation, meaning getting school buses to be electric. Why? Again, from an equity, who's a vulnerable population? Children. Who is going to be exposed to diesel emissions? The fine particulates of the diesels are the bad ones from a human health perspective. Well, if you get clean school buses, meaning electric school buses in low-income areas, you will reduce the impact on children. And we know that low-income areas, this is true nationwide, circumstances do differ from here to there, but generally speaking, low-income neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods, generally have lower air quality from a human health perspective. So putting electric buses in low-income neighborhoods, low-income school districts, helps with equity as well as human health, and it meets climate goals. So it means going through all these recommendations at a fine-tooth comb and really saying, how do we make these fair and equitable? And I'll talk one more and then I'll stop, which is remote working, something we're all doing and some of you folks are doing today online. And I will tell you this, the Equity Committee came out with a fairly strong recommendation in support of continuing remote work. And here's the rationale. Childcare flexibility, flexibility in work hours, less exposure to disease, fewer barriers to employees with disabilities, decreased need for formal clothing, right? You don't have to buy suits. It was the first time I put a tie on for a while. Reduce cars per household. So there's all these reasons that benefit families and low-income people from remote working for those that can. Not every job can be made remote. We all recognize that. What are the greenhouse gas advantages from remote working? Reduced commuting time, reduced, and so you're not driving as much to work. Reduced traffic for those who are still driving to the office. Reduced office space, reduced traffic congestion, improved potentially improving energy efficiency at home because now people are paying attention to their home use. But there's the rub. As all these people work at home, you also have increased energy use at the home. And if they have centralized HVAC, heating and air conditioning, they could actually have more. If someone works at home now and turns on a home-based, not just a room-based air conditioner for the summer, they could be using more energy than they would at the office. And the problem, of course, and the big one here is two other big offsetting factors. The evidence suggests, and it's, again, this is statistical averages and it depends on the place and the city and location and time, but generally people move further away from work who telecommute because you only come in 2 or 3 days a week or 4 days a week. So people tend to move further from work. So when they do go to work, they're driving further. Secondarily, you have to understand that in driving, only about 30% of emission, only about 30% of driving is to and from work or school. The rest is recreation, church, shopping, visiting all the friends. So the only way really to make remote working greenhouse gas better is to make the communities where people will be remotely working sustainable so that people can walk and not be forced to say, well, I didn't drive to work today. I'm going to make a specialty trip to the grocery store because I can't walk there, right? You want to have shopping and restaurants in walkable distance to where people live because they're not driving into the office. So it means a redesign of communities, essentially is what this means, to get those benefits. But we're still recommending it from an equity perspective for all those reasons, childcare, not the least of which is a real problem. So, and then I will say this, autonomous vehicles, really, really interesting. I've been trying to get funding to run an autonomous vehicle on downtown Portland in exchange for one of the buses. We had a big coalition all built and it was all about to go, and then COVID hit and the funding dried up. But I'm still hoping to try to do some testing of autonomous vehicles on a currently used bus served route to see about social acceptability. Again, you want things to work for the elderly, or as my friends in the disabled community tell me, Jonathan, you're on the way there. And some days I feel it more than ever, which is like, yeah, I want that bus that gets lower. I don't want to have to always use my smartphone. Gosh, it's hard. Some of the young folks here think nothing of it. But if you want to use an autonomous vehicle and you have to summon it with a smartphone, that's a pretty big problem. So you got to think about how the technology that we use is inclusive of who we want it to serve. If you think about who rides mass transit and you think, oh, maybe we could get rid of a bus driver and save some money and it's nice, steady, always running autonomous vehicles, is somebody with some mobility issues and or doesn't keep up with all their cell phone apps really going to be able to use that service, and are they going to trust it? And is it going to work in winter? So anyway, that's work that needs to be done. It's a matter of putting the coalitions together to do that work. University of Maine has a great, the VEMI Center, stands for VEMI. The VEMI Center, you can look it up, has a vehicle simulator, a very sophisticated one, where they can do 3D imaging of driving down roads. So we want to use the vehicle simulator with an autonomous on-road vehicle and test. So that's work that we anticipate doing in the next year or so. And so anyway, I could go on forever about this stuff. I'm gonna wrap up here and say, look, the center, we always have an issue with funding. This type of work that I'm talking about is super interesting. I'm extremely fortunate to get to do it. It's all about writing grants and building coalitions and working with people, because there isn't just money out there to do this work. You have to make it happen. And the center and having the Margaret Chase Smith's honorable name and the support of colleagues allows us to do what I think we are set out to do, which is to be a nonpartisan center, truly nonpartisan. Some people say it, but I mean it. I mean, I want to want to, it shouldn't matter who's in the governor's office for the work we do. And it is interdisciplinary. As I mentioned, work with historians, anthropologists, engineers, economists. I don't really care about the discipline. This is where I differ from some of my colleagues. I really don't care almost what the degree is. The question is, what can you do? What are the interests? What are you going to bring to the table? Is it a cultural analysis of how to get people to use new technology and how to make it work? Or is it analysis of the actual second by second energy use? Both are important skills, and we can't, the center is, I hope, to be a home to all that. And as I say, I'm happy to talk much more, but I'm gonna stop and leave more time for questions rather than try to just talk. So anyway, I'm gonna stop there and thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So the way we are going to handle questions is I'll get the pump primed and ask a question. Any those out in the virtual audience, if you have questions, if you could put them in the chat box, and we'll have people monitoring that. And then people here in the audience, if you have questions as well, we will field those. And so, Jonathan, the question I have for you is if people want to know more about the work that the Policy Center is doing. You already alluded to, is there a way that people can get on the Maine Policy Review mailing list?
Yeah, of course, just you can send me or David or either one of us, or we're not the right people, but we're easy to
I can
find.
move it on.
We can move it on. Just send us an email. We'll get you on the mailing list. You can get a hard copy for free. We love donations, but we'll give it away for free, or you can, of course, download it. And any of these reports, John Taylor at the library here, he's helping us one day a week on our social media. So we have a lot of this up on our Margaret Chase Smith web. Just search Margaret name, topic, our name, and it'll come up on we have Instagram and Facebook and all those modern communication devices, but it's always a challenge breaking through that.
Do we have any chat questions?
We don't have any yet, but we have a comment from Pam White, who said,
Oh,
so
Pam.
happy that transportation issues were addressed. Interesting. Keep up the great work.
Pam was our speaker at the Leek Shaw Lecture on International Affairs about Haiti last fall. So it's good to see Pam.
Amazing, amazing person.
I believe a UMaine alumna, former ambassador to Haiti. And anyone in the room have any questions for Jonathan? I have a whole list of questions because I could do interviews, but so Allison, you need to leave at noon, so let's get your questions in.
So I'm really pleased that you talked about school transportation, because one of my colleagues in the legislature, Eloise Vitelli, was working on bills like that. Do you know what, I mean, are you, and maybe this is outside your bailiwick, are you doing any kind of pilots?
Well, I mean, there's at least, I know Bar Harbor has an electric bus as a demonstration already.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are two others that were recently purchased by Maine, somewhere in the state of Maine. I was told in the recent meeting there are two more purchased. So it's, is there a centralized location for this? Not really. Efficiency Maine has a lot of great information, but the school bus program is not going to be under Efficiency Maine's jurisdiction. Maine Department of Transportation, I could probably find out where those buses are, but the clean school buses is a great first step. It's there.
I see we have an online question.
We do, from Jan Sherman, who says, these issues are fascinating. Is there a way to get these issues and reports into the popular media to stimulate a broader conversation among regular folk?
Yeah, I think that is a great question, and I am open to suggestions on that. I mean, as I mentioned, the center does all this work. We love doing it. When you go in how we get it out there, I'd welcome suggestions, and I mean that. And I can even put some money behind this. But it's really hard to have that conversation, to break through that sort of, we all get inundated, right? How do you say to people, this is not a spin, this is actually just sort of factual, it's a little dry. I don't know how to do that. This is one of the reasons I'm so thankful to be here today.
And it's also a reason that Jonathan has asked for one of our staff members, John Taylor, to spend one day a week trying to get some of this content out through social media.
It is, and it's like that SALT report that I mentioned, road salt, super important. It is 125 pages, and unless you understand a lot of statistics, you know, not even just basic, like 4 years of statistics, you're not going to read the whole thing, right? And so we got to translate that. I recognize that is our duty to translate it, but it's hard.
And you're talking about the effects on people. I've been told if I want to pass inspection in the fall, that there's a hole in my undercarriage that needs to be fixed, which I'm sure is due to road salt.
Well, okay, it's not due to roads. Well, okay, let's just be clear. I have 2 cars. My Subaru, which is old, does not have rusted out because they've designed the metal and with salt in mind. Some manufacturers have gotten a little cheap and made the vehicles more susceptible to it. So part of it is the vehicle you're purchasing, whether or not they actually have formulated the metals to be salt resistant. So partly it's a manufacturer problem, and partly it's we use a lot of salt. And you should get an electric vehicle. As I drove in my electric vehicle here today, and I said, David, where's the charging station here? So there's no charging station at the library here, and I hope that's rectified, but let's upgrade. Let's get you a new ride.
We do have some plans in the work for possibly putting in a new parking lot. And if we put in a new parking lot, then we will have to put in charging stations to address the future.
Yeah, and I'll be still, for those in person, anybody wants to take a look at the vehicle that's sitting out in the parking lot, it's.
As soon as he pulled in today, he offered me a test drive.
They're amazing vehicles. You know, it's just, as an early adopter, I accept the fact that I have to come to places and realize I may not have charging. And so you have to think ahead a bit more, and not everybody's willing to do that. But that is a high priority for the state. And there's, I believe, $20 million coming to the state over the next year and a half for additional charging. That is money that's already been approved by Congress under the COVID Relief Act. It's ARPA, if you're into the acronyms, the ARPA funding for that. And that's going to go to Maine, Efficiency Maine, and the Maine Department of Transportation to those chargers in. But that still doesn't mean every location like this probably needs them as well. So.
And to continue on with the theme about communicating this information, you had a former colleague, Laura Lindenfeld, who that was her specialty, and the discipline she was coming from was communications, but she was snatched up by one of the SUNY campuses where she started a program in conjunction with Alan Alda, whose project in retirement has been to get scientists to better communicate the knowledge that they have to the public. You've seen him on PBS with some of his shows, but then you want to specifically work with the technical community to get them to be better communicators. And so they started an Alan Alda Center. I think it's at SUNY Stony Brook.
I don't remember which SUNY it is, but it is really a problem. I mean, people like myself, you know, we go to grad school, we take all those years, but communicating to the public is actually not something most of us are trained in. I've tried to get better at it, and I welcome opportunities like this, but it's you know, it's not necessarily something we're trained in. It's really hard.
Well, I'm going to let Allison ask again, because she needs to be a bit new.
Well, so I'm really pleased about the road salt thing, and I was wondering, you know, and this gets to communication and public policy, right? Because I'm also a selectman in a small town. I learned about road salt, and I know that part of the increase is due to climate change.
Likely.
Well, so yeah. So how do we have, you know, you said something about, you know, starting conversations at the town level. Do you have suggestions on how to do that?
I think one way to do it would be to say, you know, right, you have primary, secondary, and tertiary roads, right? Meaning the interstate, the connectors, and then your local roads. Again, using less jargon. You really should say, well, what level of service, like how quickly do we want the roads in front of your house? Do they need to be plowed in how many hours? And is the policy to get those down to bare roads, or can you live with packed snow? And then again, it may differ. Do you have a lot of people who may want to walk in the road because there are no sidewalks? that may change your calculus, right? So it's going to be those micro levels of saying, where do we really need to put the money? Do we need, like the school budget? I know you argue over, do we need that school resource officer? Maybe you should be saying, do we need on those roads over in that part of town, do we really need to get down to plowing every time?
Is there some either organization like Maine Municipal Association? or
Maine Municipal,
Maine
Maine
DOT?
Maine DOT is great on this. Brian Byrne is their head of their group that we work with there. Maine Municipal is great. Clear Roads is a national organization. In the southern part of the state, there's the Long Creek task force that's trying to look specifically at targeting Long Creek to reduce the water, the salt into Long Creek, which is really a serious issue. So they're a task force, but, and I'm sure Maine Municipal, I would think they would come with training and talk to you about this, because it really is like.
And this is actually a topic that did get good public coverage. I know you were interviewed for several news broadcasts. If you just do a Google search, you'll find some of that. You had a question.
Well, I was actually wondering about the road salt. So this is kind of news to me, I guess. I missed those news broadcasts, and I was wondering, as a nonpartisan institution, how do you come up with that as a research interest? I mean, I understand that the climate initiative that the governor passed, that is something legislated, and then you take on pieces of that. But it seems like this road salt, was this an interest of yours, or did a different group come to you with that?
The road salt issue, it's for those in the small community, it's known, right? It's admittedly a small community. And so Maine DOT came to us, in fact, and said, would you be interested in looking at this? Maine Department of Transportation came to us and said, you've been looking at this. And their motivation was in part, not exclusively, but in part because of the contaminated wells. They are on the hook under state law to remediate wells contaminated with road salt. And so they said, look, can we get ahead of this? We want to maintain safety. We want to maintain mobility. It's important for economics that we maintain mobility, but can we do something about this? And so that's why we did such an in-depth look at this. And to answer the question also about associated with climate change, the reason we think climate change is driving more salt use is because you don't just, if you get a cold snow and it's nice, crisp snow, the stuff we love, it can be pushed off a road very easily. If it melts, then you've got it adhering to the road, and now you've got a problem that you probably need salt on to break that bond. And so we think that the mechanism is increased freeze-thaw cycles with more variable weather from climate. But it's not strictly true that we can associate climate with salt use. It just, there's not enough fine-grained evidence. We think it's true, but we can't prove it with, say, a statistical test at this point in time.
Can I follow up on the well question?
Sure.
So if 70% of the salt is put down by municipalities, and the DOT is only responsible for remediation of the 20, was it 20%?
Yeah, okay. At the
So
town
how does that
level,
work?
towns are responsible too,
Yeah,
and
okay, they are.
and they're insured by Maine Municipal Association through a risk pool, and they pay out penalties. They pay out
Gotcha.
remediation through a risk policy.
Okay.
But Maine DOT gets most of the attention because it's Maine DOT. And so people look to them first.
Anything further in the chat box?
We don't have any more questions at this time, but if anyone wants to add any.
Okay, yeah, there's still an opportunity for those in the virtual world to ask questions. Barbara Harity, who is the editor of the Maine Policy Review, has put in her email address, the Maine Policy Review's email address, if anyone wants to get on the mailing list. Anyone else in here in the room? Peter.
I'm sorry to come in so late, whatever,
Yep.
one thing after another, but here I am. On road salt, I didn't realize that's what you were going to be talking about, but when I worked at DEP, I was involved in a study of road salt storage. And I went to and investigated some studies that were being done in New Brunswick. And in New Brunswick, they had some study sites. One was a road salt and sand, developed, but open to the air. And they had all kinds of salty water draining away and affecting people's wells. And they then thought that it would be a good idea to have some kind of a roof over it. And so they did that kind of study. And hey, don't you know, solved the problem, which is why we now have plenty of road salt sheds that can be quite useful in the summertime, even without any sand and salt in them.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, there's been a lot of improvements. That is covering the salt stockpiles is good practice, is best practice, and that's largely been done now.
Yes,
So the easy stuff like that is, I think, done.
it's the roadside well.
It's the roadside well. Some of this also, you know, it's on the landowner a little bit. How far is their well going to be from the, you know, it's the difference between new construction versus an old historic hand dug well. You know, there's some issues there about, you know, do you put a well next to a road that, you know, so there's all those issues. But really the problem really is the expectations of people and for their travel. It's hard to say, you know, maybe you can't really expect after a foot of snow to drive till maybe 24, 48 hours. It's a hard conversation to have. But the consequences of, you know what the consequences are of not doing that. These are choices.
Here's another question that occurred to me, and we generally, a town generally apportions property taxes higher in town than out of town. It occurs to me that road salt use is one thing, but garbage collection is another, and mailboxes are another, where maybe we should charge more for the people who are living out in the country.
I'm not going to touch that one. And I shouldn't charge more for people, you know, it's a legitimate issue. Should we charge more for folks who choose to live in areas that generate more cost? You know, it's a valid question. You know, clearly that's a philosophical question. The United States Postal Service obviously was set up with the philosophy of one price as a way to unite the country. But it is a fair question to ask, is that model still make sense? I don't think research answers that question. I think that's a values question.
Yes, yes.
So we're getting the food ready for folks. So this is sort of going to be there I see a question. When we speak of road salt, what are you talking about? It says calcium chloride.
Sodium chloride.
Okay.
But calcium chloride is also used in lesser amounts. And calcium chloride, CaCl, has a property that is superior to sodium chloride in the sense that it melts at lower temperatures. So road salt or table salt is far cheaper than calcium chloride, but it only works to about 20 degrees. And after that, the melting capacity goes down. So you can use, there's some other not just calcium chloride, there's other salts that melt at lower temperatures.
So your friend Brian at DOT in one of these television interviews, was talking about beet juice and molasses. Did you know anything about that? Or you have to ask Brian about
No, beet juice and molasses are used. Agricultural products like that are often used to keep the salt and the sand more adheres. You don't want to spread the salt and have it just roll off the roads, right? That doesn't do any good. So some of these things are really used to maintain some consistency. There's no melting value to these things, but they are used in proprietary blends because they improve the effectiveness, mainly I think through the mechanical action of binding the salt and the sand to where you want to put it.
All right, so this is going to be last call for the virtual audience because we're going to sort of shift to in-person so we can start feeding the people who are here. Do we have any questions in the room before I ask a question? And then we'll get to the eating part.
David.
Or more informal
Did you
discussion.
ask Joe's question?
I did. Yeah.
David, I just wanted to point out that Barbara put in the chat, so put it out
Yeah, I
there
mentioned
for
it.
everybody that if you want to get on NPR's mailing list, you just need to email m as in Margaret PR@maine.edu.
So Joe had a follow-up question about whether the calcium chloride, are there different effects of these different products on the damage they do to the road itself?
Okay, so it's really, we look specifically at this question. There's about 5 different chemicals that are used nationwide for melting. By volume, and sodium chloride is the biggest. And the question is one inherently better than the other? And the answer is not really. They may show differences in laboratory settings, but the empirical evidence of in use does not show much difference. It's really, so that is a fairly straightforward one. But some of the damages, not to ecosystems, but to human-built systems like roads and cars, that can be mitigated through better construction of the roads and the cars. But the ecosystem damages are still going to be there regardless.
Any other questions in the room?
In your study, did you work in any variables with damage to ecosystems? I don't know, just salamanders or
No, not.
amphibians or plants?
Yeah, so the question is, do we look at what ecosystems? We did a literature review. We did not do primary research on this, but what it means is that in a place like Maine, salt tolerant species are going to be invasive.
Yeah.
So grasses and plants that are not native to Maine, that may be salt tolerance, will tend to overtake native species. That's one thing. And then certain animal organisms are going to be harmed at the larval and other stages through increased salinity in fresh waters, and so we'll hurt those.
So that was part of your.
Yes, but we didn't focus on specific those. You know, that wasn't the primary focus.
Any other questions before we go informal and get some food? I want to thank our virtual audience. I don't see any more questions coming into the chat box. Remind you that I did put in links to our YouTube channel, the MCS Library, and there's a playlist there of the interviews, the 7 interviews I did with Jonathan's colleagues. We didn't even really touch on the vast array of projects that are being worked on. There were really some very interesting work, and you can listen to the interviews about those. And I also included some interviews I did with students, because the Policy Center does work with UMaine students. There's a Margaret Chase Smith Public Affairs Scholarship. And you can see an example of some of the work that one student did, Ellie Pelletier, who was a essay contest winner about 3 years ago. And she wants to be a veterinarian. And she's very interested in the shortage of veterinarians in the state of Maine, and what policies can be created so that there are more veterinarians, particularly in rural areas. So this is a poster presentation that she did as part of that. And she's been funded to go on for now a 2nd year. She's done the research to identify the problem. So really in the 2nd year, what she's going to be working more on is what public policy can be instituted to try to address this issue of the shortage of vets. And then another student has also been funded, and he is interested in some different ways to try to address the drug epidemic from the standpoint of from the judicial system, rather than just putting people in prison. Or he's going to look at drug courts. Are drug courts more effective to try to prevent recidivism? And the Policy Center does a huge amount of work with the drug crisis.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything?
Just Marcy Sorg is a force of nature. She's a senior, she's a senior staffer at the center. She probably personally employs 15 people working on substance abuse harm reductions, naloxone distribution. It's a huge effort right now, as you probably know. I'm sure you guys know. You may know somebody personally, and I'm sorry for that, of troubles with opioid addiction and overdose. And we have a lot of people working on those issues. It's very hard work. I feel sorry for some of my colleagues who have to read some of these primary materials about people who may have committed suicide or used drugs, and their lives are not necessarily happy materials, but we need to understand why, so we can't have interventions unless you understand why this is occurring. So we have some staff members working very hard work.
There's actually an ad running on the radio right now, giving the number of deaths, which is 600 and something.
Yeah, it's tragic. Nationwide, a little over 100,000 people have died of drug overdoses in the last year. That exceeds car accidents and firearms. Drug is the single leading cause of death right now, is opioid addiction, overdoses.
And I think the ad is then promoting a program called Options. And if I remember correctly, I think Alex West is doing something with the Options program, which is a staff member at the Policy Center.
I don't know I'm sorry.
It's a sprawling empire, right?
I can't keep track of. I trust the people like Marcy Sorg at the top. I can't follow all that work.
So again, I thank our virtual audience, and the final thought I want to leave them with is, Jonathan mentioned earlier on that when Margaret Chase Smith was approached to lend her name to this center, the director at the time was Steve Ballard, and the remark that Margaret Chase Smith is supposed to have made, it's oral history, it may be somewhat apocryphal on how it's been shaped. What she supposedly said to Steve Ballard was, "You must promise me that you will try things that are important." So that's one of the things that we hope we encourage here at the Margaret Chase Smith Library, is for people to try things that are important.
No, David, thank you for the reminder. I think I try to live on that. I think people take it very seriously, and we love working at the library. It's a partnership. Yeah, so.
And much more so since we've come under the rubric of the University of Maine.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy.
So again, I thank our virtual audience. You're welcome to linger on. There's still 20 people. You can watch us eat. That's what you missed by not being here today.
Free.
And yes, and hopefully, next spring, fingers crossed, we can get back to in-person. Like I say, our last in-person Maine Town meeting, we had 90 people here. I don't know that we'll get to those numbers again. We'll probably need to space out a little better into the future, but hopefully we'll begin to build our numbers back up for a live presentation. So I thank our virtual audience. We will just go informal in person now and give you a chance to eat and to make our presentation to Simon. So the food is available back here. It's from Heritage House.
Hopefully you've remembered what you've ordered.
There's plenty though. And
There
so
is plenty.
there's probably even